may have popped the proverbial champagne a little too soon. The former White House chief strategist has rejoined Breitbart News, and he's made it clear he is still going to fight for the Trump agenda, saying, quote, in many ways, I think I can be more effective fighting from the outside for the agenda President Trump ran on. And anyone who stands in our way, we will go to war with. Ending a sentence with a preposition notwithstanding. Joining me now is Democratic Congressman Adam Schiff, chairman of the House, ranking member of the House Intelligence Committee. Congressman, good to see you as always.
Good to see you, Jake.
So in response to President Trump's firing of Bannon, you tweeted, quote, glad to see Bannon gone. He never belonged in the White House, but the problem persists since the most profound source of division cannot be fired. Your position on President Trump and Bannon clear there. But let me ask you, is there anyone else in the White House that you think should not be there?
There's certainly a lot of people on the White House staff and NSC staff that shouldn't be there. People like Miller and Gorka and others who not only, I think, represent the same thing that Steve Bannon did, but aren't capable of doing the job well. So, yes, I think there's more cleaning house that ought to take place. But as I mentioned in that tweet, Jake, the more fundamental problem is at the very top. I think what the president had to say about the demonstrations in Boston and elsewhere was perfectly fine, perfectly unobjectionable, but perfectly inadequate after that debacle of a press conference he had supposedly on infrastructure. The real, I think, challenge and job for the chief executive in a country where race has always been such a difficult conversation is to do everything possible to bring our country together, to help make us a more perfect union. And what the president did this week was as if he stood on a line dividing the country and pushed to separate one American from another with all his might. And that is not what this country needs.
After President Trump's comments appearing to equate white supremacists and the counter-protesters, your fellow Democrat on the House Intelligence Committee, Jackie Speier, tweeted, quote, POTUS is showing signs of erratic behavior and mental instability that place the country in grave danger. Time to invoke the 25th Amendment. That's the amendment that would allow the removal of the president. Do you agree that President Trump is mentally unstable?
Well, I certainly think that there's an issue with the president's capability. There's some attribute of his character that makes him seemingly incapable of introspection and a broad understanding of what the country really needs. And I think it's a question that people are asking, what is going on with this president? What could explain this kind of behavior? It began at the very beginning, Jake. I remember when he had won the election and within days seemed to suggest that the only reason he didn't win the popular vote was that millions of people illegally came to the country and voted. And I thought to myself, oh my God, this man is not only going to not grow with the job, but is willing to say things that are just patently untrue. I'm convinced if you took somebody off the street of America and you said, you've just become president, but here's the deal, you didn't win the popular vote, they would have the common sense to say, look, I'm going to do everything I can to win over everyone. I realize that many people, indeed most people, didn't vote for me, but he didn't do that. He's not capable of doing that, and I don't understand why, but I do recognize what a serious problem it is, and I think more than when I say it or when Jackie Speier says it, the fact that Bob Corker now says things along the same lines shows a broadening recognition that there are some serious issues with our president that aren't going to go away, that aren't going to get better, and indeed, with the pressures of the job, may very well get worse. And I think for that reason, at a minimum, we need the very best people around him in the White House. And that means not people like Bannon, not people like Miller, not people like Gorka, but rather some more adults in the room.
It sounds like you're saying that you don't disagree with Jackie Speier, who said that President Trump is showing signs of erratic behavior, mental instability, and so it sounds like you're not disagreeing with that. What about the 25th Amendment part, which would call for the removal of the president? Do you agree with that?
I don't think we're at a point of thinking about the 25th Amendment. For one thing, this is something that the Vice President and Cabinet would need to come together on. I think what the authors of that amendment principally had in mind was some kind of physical incapacitation or serious mental illness or a breakdown, an inability to function in office. And I think we're still far from concluding that that's the case, even though we find many of us his conduct anathema, and there to be a serious problem here. But I don't think it, particularly at this point in time, makes a lot of sense to focus on the 25th Amendment. I do think it means that we have to put real constraints on this president. We have to make sure that our system of checks and balances in Congress work. I think, frankly, the most powerful thing we could do, rather than pursue the 25th Amendment at this point, is make sure that one house or the other, and ideally both, are in Democratic hands, frankly, the hands of a party not in the White House, to be a more effective check on some of the damage this president can do.
Congressman, let me ask you, President Trump was obviously widely condemned for his comments in which he seemed to be equating both sides for the violence and hatred in Charlottesville. But obviously, let's remove the idea that there's any moral equivalence. Is there any legitimacy to the argument that the violent tactics of groups like Antifa make matters worse and that Democrats and progressives need to condemn them?
You know, anyone that's committing violence ought to be condemned. Anyone. There's no justification for it whatsoever. But I do think that cannot be allowed to obscure the fact that millions of people are gathering around the country and have since this president was inaugurated in the most peaceful form of protests. And we can't allow the commander-in-chief to somehow equate the handful of people that would make those protests violent with any kind of sentiment that condones white supremacy or neo-Nazism. And I think it all gets back to the point you made earlier, Jake. And I think the fundamental problem here is that the President of the United States can't bring himself to repudiate a part of his support, and that is that small group of bigots that are supporters of his. He's taken a position essentially that if you're with me, you can do no wrong. And I won't condemn you practically anything that you do. His difficulty during the campaign in your interview to condemn David Duke is not at all unlike the difficulty he's had this week in a full-throated, unequivocal repudiation of sentiment and an ideology that we not only find repugnant, but we fought a world war over. So I think that's the root of the problem.
Congressman Adam Schiff, Democrat of California, thank you so much. Good to see you as always, sir.
Thank you, Jake.
One Republican senator now saying he worries that there's more violence to come, and he says he doubts President Trump can bring the country together in the event that happens. That's next.
CNN.
I think everything changed last weekend. I think that was one of those moments in a nation's history where everything turns.
That's the mayor of Charlottesville, Michael Signer, speaking just 1 week after that white supremacist rally and the Tiki Torch March through his town. Let's talk about it all with the panel. Bakari Sellers, let me ask you, do you think that it's true that everything changed for the country last weekend?
Well, I think it was a tragic day for the country, but white supremacy is not new. It didn't start with Donald Trump. It has been magnified and lifted up and put on another playing field, but I don't think that anything has necessarily changed. It won't change until individuals who don't look like Nina and I decide that enough is enough. This isn't a partisan issue. And so many people confuse patriotism and prejudice. And what we saw on display was so much prejudice. And I hope that individuals, especially white evangelicals in the United States of America, decide to stand up and say enough is enough. And Donald Trump is perverting and giving these individuals a platform, and he should not. That's all we're asking for.
Congressman, you've seen a lot of the tensions up close this week in your home state. I'm sorry, your home Commonwealth of Virginia. Yeah. What was your reaction? What do you think?
Well, actually, ironically, I was in Israel when all that stuff was going on and seeing that. So, I agree with some of the things that Bakari said in terms of folks need to rise up. And largely, you have seen that, of course. I think there's no place for hate in Virginia or America. And I think that you did see that on both sides of the aisle, Democrat and Republican people coming out and condemning what was going on. It was a tragic day for Virginia and for the nation, of course, too. I was critical of the president of how the second press conference was strong and it hit the right note, but the third was not. But at the same time, I think it's important that politics of identity, racial politics, tribal politics, quite frankly, are not what this nation needs. And anyone who's espousing them, I think, are wrong. I think we should be focused on building this country as opposed to tearing it down.
Nina, what was it like for you this last week?
Heavy. I want to read a brief quote from Dr. Crystal Fleming. She wrote an article in The Root that I think informs exactly what Bakari just said. She said, it is clear that our nation is in the midst of a very public and painful reckoning with the memory and, among other things, ongoing white supremacy. And that's it. That, in other words, what transpired in Virginia was just a tipping point, but this has been happening in the country all along. And until we go deeper, showing disgust for and standing up very clearly and unified against racism and bigotry like the neo-Nazis and KKK inspired, but we got to go deeper to deal with mass incarceration in this country that locks up more black and brown folks and poor folks. We got to deal with income and wealth inequality, the inequality in our school system. So dealing with neo-Nazis is one thing, but dealing with systemic racism is another. And this is a day of reckoning for our country.
Senator?
Yeah, see, that's that kind of talk that really, I think, it causes problems for a lot of America. That says somehow or another that if you're white, you're somehow racist. And I mean, that's what it said. You talked about systemic racism, and as opposed to neo-Nazis. I agree. I mean, I think everybody has stood up and said, you know, that we're obviously against white supremacy. I don't know of anybody who has spoken in favor of
certainly on the white platform.
Yes, certainly nobody that I'm aware of. But the idea then saying, well, this is a larger problem I just would say that we have problems of racism in this country, but that's not tying that to white supremacists. I think is a whole
250 years.
Let me do Nina, and then we'll do
250 years worth of slavery, almost 100 years worth of Jim Crow in this country. The fact that the systems in this country still treat Black folks, in particular, African-American folks, as second-class citizens. And part of what the senator doesn't want to face is also part of the problem. No one has said, Bakari or nobody has said that all white people are racist. But we do in this country have racist institutions. Look, there were white folks out there marching against the neo-Nazis and the KKK. But the fact that we can't deal with systemic racism in this country, something is wrong with that.
And I hope that you're uncomfortable with the conversation, because this conversation is uncomfortable. It's something that we have to deal with. But the fact is, we can go to East Chicago and we can go to Flint, Michigan. Yes. And let me tell you that they have environmental injustices that do not happen in Orange County. Right. There are places that do not happen in affluent areas of this country, affluent white areas of this country. In South Carolina,
how about poor white areas?
There's no doubt about it. They're suffering. But let's have a conversation about the systemic injustices that we have. And there's a direct.
But the systemic injustices are not necessarily race injustices.
They're also.
You're saying that they're more. You're saying
there are some, but
class is what you're saying.
Yeah, this look.
And then we'll come to you.
This is an issue about, and I think we can agree on that. There are problems in this country where there are millions of people who do not have opportunities and to be able to rise. But you can find that in rural areas of this country, throughout Appalachia and areas of my state and West Virginia, Kentucky, just so you can find them in Detroit and Philadelphia and other places. And to suggest that is racist in base, I just think clouds the issue that we have serious problems to confront here, and covering it with race is, I just think, not.
One second,
let me touch on a couple of things, because I think there's some good points on both sides here. Both Nina and the senator have brought up good points. And when you look at, and I think you have to separate some things. So when you look at Virginia, you can't drive 5-10 miles without seeing something that is a monument to the war dead in the Civil War, or a Civil War battlefield, or a monument itself. That is a separate issue for one of the things that Nina brought up, which I agree with. We do have a big problem with criminal justice reform here, and we need improvement. There's no question about that. Economic opportunity for folks, both in white Appalachia as well as in black communities as well, too. There's no question about that, but you have to separate the two. They are not the same thing.
But they are.
Hold on. They're not the same thing when you're talking about white supremacists and marching and taking monuments, saying that symbol, like a monument to war dead or something like that, or even Jefferson, for example, some of his, and you have seen the conversation move to that direction. That there are very real problems that we need to address in criminal justice improvement and other substantive problems. That's not the same thing as marching and taking down a statue that someone has driven by 1,000 times and never even had any problem with.
Income and wealth inequality. My only point is this.
I agree with that.
Is that in our face, overt racism and bigotry that was on display in Virginia is one thing.
Small, tiny,
but we deal with that. But I'm saying beyond that, and that's what Professor Fleming was saying too. How do we deal with, in this country, systemic racism? I get Appalachia. I visit Appalachia. I travel Appalachia. I understand. I talked to a woman yesterday by the name of Portia who lives in Ohio, who was crying her eyes out. She is on the front lines for racial equality, but she also talks about the fact that in in her county in Ohio that there are poor white folks, and I get that. And so the fact that we're willing to talk about class, but sometimes you guys don't want to
you have
talk
to talk
about
about both.
race.
Let's do Bakari and then the senator.
But I can't let you separate that because that's an easy way out. That's a cop out. And the reason that it's a cop out is because you have this conversation about race. And these statues, these monuments, many of them were erected during the Jim Crow era when we were making progress in civil rights. It was a big thumb in your eye. That's why the Confederate flag went up in South Carolina. That's why these monuments went up throughout the country. And to have a statue of someone,
not all of them.
but that's a lot of them. And to have a statue of someone like a Robert E. Lee, to have a statue of someone like a Pitchfork Ben Tillman or John C. Calhoun, whose name, by the way, was John C. Killicoon, to have these individuals just revered. Do you understand how a black, you may not, but as a black man, let me tell you, that is very, very painful.
Don't talk condescendingly.
No, I'm not, but I'm just saying that is very painful. And the reason that is painful, and this conversation has to be uncomfortable, the reason that is painful is because
I'm comfortable having these conversations. Let me say, listen, you have to be able to separate some things. There's no question about it. Look, I understand you can be empathetic to understand how you're coming from and where we're coming from. Some of these monuments in Virginia, for example, and there are millions of Virginians who don't support this because some of these are their families. Some of those are sacred monuments to war dead. Those are big issues, and their history is very layered. Let me paraphrase the black mayor of Richmond, LeVar Stoney, who's a great man, who said a couple months ago, this has since changed, but a couple months ago he said, because of politics, but he said, keep the statues, but teach the context. Create more statues to teach history and the context. That is extremely important. Our history is not perfect. It's imperfect. But we have the ability to move towards a more perfect union, and most countries don't have that.
We're just going to take a very quick break and continue this conversation. We just have to pay some bills. Stick around. We're back with our panel. I want to put something up in the midst of this essential but admittedly uncomfortable conversation. Here are the covers of the Time magazine, The Economist, and The New Yorker, all with President Trump or thereabouts, tying him to a Nazi salute and twice to the Klan. Senator Santorum, your thoughts?
Well, I mean, look, the fact that we're having this conversation is a good thing. The fact is that we don't have this conversation often because it does tend to descend into that, which is, okay, if you speak out at all and try to have any kind of conversation about this from a conservative perspective, well, you're just, you're a bigot, you're a racist. And the reality is that there are real problems in this country, that some of them are race is an issue, but there are a lot of issues that cut across that. And I think that's the fact that everything gets conflated, that it's race, I just think is wrong. I mean, the reality is that there are a lot of people in this country who are suffering. I don't think it's class either. I don't accept there are classes in America, like there are in other countries in the world, but there are people who are hurting that we have to have solutions and be able to address those. And when the issue is, if it happens to be a minority, that somehow the condition is because of their race, I think it just obscures the larger problem. And that's where I think the discussion needs to be.
Nina?
I mean, it's just our unwillingness to really deal with this. I mean, every generation we're hit with something that reminds us of how we started as a country. Yes, there's lots of suffering in this country, but a lot of the undercurrents of that suffering we can link in some way to race and or class. And that is how this country was founded, this whole revisionist history about, the framers, all men are created equal, when we know good and daggone well that all men were not created equal when the framers wrote those words. Now, the fact that they wrote to form a more perfect union somewhere in there, that's what we're doing generation after generation, but not to be able to sit here and tell the truth about these issues. And every time African Americans want to talk about the injustices that happen to them in this country, all of a sudden they're told, no, you're paying, you didn't hurt that much, or what's happening to you and your neighbors and down the street is not really that much pain. When Bakari brought up the Flint, Michigan, that whole thing, in terms of the fact that they still, almost 4 years, still do not have the infrastructure that is necessary to give them clean water. Now, I will add a point that there are 3,000 other areas in this country where the lead levels are higher than Flint, Michigan. But when you look at environmental injustice or environmental racism, you look at communities, mainly communities of color, and then on the other side, communities that are poor. So we got to deal with this.
So, Bakari, let me ask you. The idea of the framers writing all men are created equal. It seems to a lot of people that the aspirations of the framers, remember it says all men, it doesn't even mention women,
Right.
that the aspirations are what's important, not necessarily who they were at that moment in time. Is that not a fair argument?
I think that's a legitimate argument. I think, and that helps us in this argument where Donald Trump was somewhat perverting history by equating Robert E. Lee to George Washington. We know that one was an aspirational figure who, although he owned slaves, and we need to reckon with that and deal with that. We have to deal with that and understand that. His goal was a more perfect union. Robert E. Lee thought that slavery was actually good for the mentality of the African American or the African. He thought that that was good for people who look like me. And that's not where we are. But I have to comment quickly because I want Senator Santorum to understand that I want his voice to be a part of this discussion. Like, you are a white evangelical Christian, and you Catholic, sorry.
But the evangelicals love him.
But evangelicals love you. But we still want you to be a part of the conversation, and your voice is necessary because what we saw Saturday in Charlottesville, those people weren't fringe elements. Those were bankers and physician assistants, and they're teachers and college students.
That's important. I think that there.
I mean, the neo-Nazi fascists. I'm saying those are real people.
Well, of course, they're real people, but there is a very, very small piece of the population that got a tremendous amount of headlines. And for whatever reason, we can argue why they got that headline. I think it is important. One of the things that you said, it's important to understand who Washington was. It's important to understand who Robert E. Lee was. It's important to understand how we are where we are today. And I think what's important, and I've been to many countries around the world where you don't have racial justice and no mechanism to be able to move in that direction. There are many problems today, and I acknowledge those, and I love this conversation. I think it's great, and I'm working towards this in Congress to deal with some of these issues. But the reality is our imperfect history, our imperfect union has a mechanism to get better. Now, it could be faster for some people. There's no question about that. But the reality is, thank God that we have the ability to improve like many other countries do not.
Thank you, one and all. I'm sorry. Thank you. This was a great conversation to be continued, hopefully, all over America for the next few decades. These topics are sure to come up tomorrow night when I'm going to be moderating an exclusive town hall with House Speaker Paul Ryan. He'll take